Welcome to Trends with Benefits, an award-winning podcast by Van Eck with a forward-looking perspective. We explore new ways of thinking about the markets, work, and life. Here's your host, Ed Lopez.
Hey, Rob, how are you?
Ed, great to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really happy to have you on the podcast. And for those listening, welcome to another episode of Trends with Benefits. My guest today is Rob Lane. He is CFO at Sunnova. And I'm really excited about this, Rob, because I've been wanting to talk to somebody in the solar industry for a while, not only just from a potential investment standpoint, but also just from a personal standpoint. You know, should I look at solar and put that on my house? I love the idea of energy independence for myself. So thanks again for joining. I'm really happy to have you here.
No, I really appreciate the opportunity.
So let's see. I think you're down in my home state, down in Texas, right? Is that where you're based?
That I am. Houston, Texas, and I know you're out there from Austin. We get there as often as we can, but other than the heat dome we've got outside right now, my gosh, I love it here.
That's great. How long have you been there?
I'm actually a native Houstonian, and so you can read all about it in the proxy, of course, but that puts me over 5 decades as a Houstonian. I spent about 12 years up in the Northeast between school and my first few jobs. But the pull to come back here was very strong and very happy that I did.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think I left Texas in '98. I think I was done with the heat, but I might come back.
I don't blame you. I don't blame you. I think, someone once told me that Houston is hot and there's nothing to do here. And because of that, it just makes it such a great community of people.
Yeah.
And so even people who came here years ago, and every energy boom, people come in and they want to work here. And then if the energy boom collapses, it doesn't really matter. People are going to stay just because the city's just got that fantastic vibe.
Yeah. Houston's a great city. I haven't been there in years. Did you start your career in the energy side of the business, in traditional energy?
I did energy and financial services. I guess I actually just spoke with an investment banker who was in my investment banking analyst class nearly 30 years ago at what is now Citigroup, but at the time the part I was in was Smith Barney, and started really cutting my teeth in tax-advantaged equity vehicles. So those would be royalty trusts and master limited partnerships on the oil and gas side. And, it's real interesting because one of the first deals I did as a banker was working on a utility deal. And I asked the utility executive, here I was, all piss and vinegar, 23 years old, having the opportunity to sit next to a CEO at dinner. And I said, hey, what's the future of a utility? And he said, the future of the utility is distributed generation. Everybody's going to have their own power and the utility is going to manage it. Now, he was thinking more about fuel cells back in the day. He was thinking that was a technology that was going to get there because while solar existed, certainly the efficiencies we had in solar weren't there quite yet. But you could say that this has always been that path that the utilities have known about for decades, and certainly that I was shown the light on at a very early age.
Yeah, that put that kernel in your head. And I guess when this opportunity came up, you jumped at it. Is that how that worked?
Absolutely. Our CEO, John Berger, he's got a fascinating story. Grew up in the construction business in Bryan, Texas, cut his teeth trading power back in the day on the East Coast, actually ran the utility during the Atlanta Olympics back in the day, and continued to move through the energy industry and the power industry, worked at the FERC for a little while as well. I had known him, my father had met him maybe about 15, 20 years ago. And my father would say, hey, look, I just met one of the most extraordinary people. You've got to get to know this guy. So when the opportunity came to work with John and to work in a company that really had a true vision, that was something I just jumped at.
That's awesome. So yeah, again, thanks for being on and coming to talk about solar with me. Like I said, it's been in the back of my mind as something to look at again. Many years ago, Van Eck had an ETF. It was a solar ETF. There's another one out there as well. It's had rough years, the broad index of solar companies, but I'm still very hopeful for the technology and what it can do for people and the environment as well. So really love the opportunity to explore that some more with you. And, I think about things this year, like we talked about earlier, the heat dome and that going on and the stress that it might cause to the grids or the various grids that are around the country. And then you've got like the Biden package, the Inflation Reduction Act, on the infrastructure bill. I don't know, are things coalescing to really come in favor for the solar industry going into the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely they are. I think that right now we're experiencing a little bit of disruption and pressure that comes from the interest rates. We're certainly not alone in that. We're just a very capital intensive business. And so interest rates are going to have an impact on what we do and how we're out there in the industry. They've also been a huge boon to us as well, and I can certainly get into that. But everything that you've talked about is definitely a catalyst. What people want is affordable, reliable power. And they're not getting that in many cases from the utility. They also want to make sure that they're doing their part when it comes to the environment. Now, that's usually something that's a nice to have. I will, in the past, what I've noticed is that folks will pay for things that they really want on their conscience, but it has a limit, right? It has a limit when that goes up against the budget. The nice thing about solar is it doesn't. Solar is budget accretive to almost every single household. And the Inflation Reduction Act, but that gave us more than anything else, was some certainty around how we could do some pricing with the tax incentives, just locking in existing tax incentives for a longer period of time. Those incentives were always on this, hey, it's going to sunset within the next couple of years. And so it was difficult for people to plan around that and difficult to raise capital around that. It just gives a lot more certainty there. And then the adders, which are for domestic content for communities that have been impacted by the energy transition and are meant to support lower income areas, are phenomenal, because the tax advantages that we can get there, we can turn around and use that to help support domestic manufacturing and domestic jobs, and to help support communities that otherwise we would not be able to get the proper access to because of technical things like banks saying, hey, we're not feeling as comfortable lending there, or greater default rates just sort of based on circumstances that are oftentimes well beyond people's control. But to be able to come in and provide what is an essential service to those homeowners, and really to any homeowner, is something that you can feel that you're doing good while hopefully doing well.
Now, earlier on, you talked about that idea of distributed energy. Is that the outlook for solar, where many people have their own little energy power plant at their house? And is the grid dependent on solar, or is the success of solar dependent upon the state of the grid that we have today?
I think that if you take a look at the grid, you got to think about the grid from two different perspectives. There's distribution and there's transmission. So when you think about the transmission side of it, this is moving power in mass from one area where it's produced to another area where it's consumed. This takes really significant investment. In my view, it can be very environmentally destructive. You got to clear big areas to be able to produce the natural resource you need, or to be able to farm that natural resource, if in that case that's solar, and then huge swaths of land that need to be cleared to run transmission lines with an appropriate amount of easement on either side of that. But if you're talking about an existing community, you're talking about a community where a new home is actually building, that infrastructure can be built in a way that is much less disruptive. Or to put it a different way, it's on an area that's already going to be disrupted, or a brownfield place that exists. So whether or not you're burying power lines, you're having power lines run through people's backyards, that distribution power can be a lot more efficient, and utilities will have their definition about whether or not it's easier to maintain or not, but it's certainly easier to move power around a distributed area. So when we've taken a look at this, the more solar that gets on rooftops, the more you're able to move that power within a community in a way that you're not really going to tax the grid nearly as much. The really nice thing about solar is you got to sort of think about, when are you using solar and when are you consuming power? So in most places, and hey, we're talking about Texas, but the heat dome seems to be pretty universal right now. Peak usage of electricity tends to happen during peak heat times of a summer day. Now, if you also have electricity that's being used for heating elements, that's the other big time when you would end up using electricity. But right now, we see really the greatest taxation the greatest taxation of a home's energy usage does happen during those peak times. And I would probably put that from about noon to 8 p.m., right? Maybe noon to 9 p.m. for most households. But that's when solar is working overtime. And that's when, if you're talking about a microgrid or a well-distributed energy community, you can share that power out from these households because they're not consuming all of it to areas that don't necessarily have as much surface area on their roof to be able to produce the electricity. So think of office buildings, a lot of industrial space, manufacturing space that might be out in the open. But just really think of multi-story buildings and areas that consume a lot of power. You can then move the power from the household to those commercial areas.
I guess I wonder, do you even need to do that? Do you even need to install new grids or whatever it is, or upgrade the grid? If you can put solar on your building and power your building, couldn't you just call it a day?
You really can't. I mean, it depends on the building, right? You got a 2-story warehouse. It's huge. Yeah, you could throw enough solar on there to make it work. You look at your skyscraper outside, even a 5-story skyscraper, it's doubtful that's going to have enough space to be able to put solar on the roof. In addition to that, I mean, there's other technologies where people talk about solar windows and things like that. I think that technology is probably not really cost productive today necessarily, but if you take yourself into a city like New York, you're really not going to have that surface area. You've got, in downtowns and in office parks, you've got tall building next to tall building next to tall building. So it's not like they're going to be able to grab all the sunlight they would be if it was just a big standalone building outside. But then if you take the power that's on a home, my home every single day produces more electricity from the hours of about 9, 10 a.m. all the way through about 8 p.m., certainly during the peak of the solstice, right, where it is producing more power than it is consuming. During the middle of the day, almost every single day, I'm producing more power than I am consuming. Now, what I'm doing is I'm holding that power in my batteries and using that power late at night, and I'm actually sending that power back to the grid when I get the demand response signals from ERCOT that they need electricity because they're taking the price from $20 a megawatt hour up to $500, $600, $700, $1,000 a megawatt hour. So I'll actually send excess electricity to the grid during that time instead of just keeping it for myself. That's sort of the ideal right there. And if you consider where you have a lot of states where they've had time of use, where basically higher rates that the utility charges during certain time periods, those time of use windows used to be from 3 to 7 p.m. because that's when peak electricity usage was. But because of solar, it's now pushed that peak net electricity usage to much later in the day. So they've been moving their time of use windows into the evening hours. So call it 5 to 9 p.m. So there's not a lot of excess solar power. Why? Because they had all this excess power coming in from the grid. And to your point, does the grid need to be updated? Absolutely. There does need to be additional infrastructure put into the grid in order to continue to update it. But we have, a lot of that, a lot of those incentives have been put into place here with some of the Infrastructure Act. What was not put into that was incentives for transmission. That's the cost of, moving the power from distant generation into the consumption centers. I would think that would certainly, without an incentive, that makes a really nice additional cost that one could put into one's rate base if one was a regulated utility.
Now, the power that you send to ERCOT that you don't need, do they pay you for that?
They do. So, we always talk about Texas as being the Wild West when it comes to retail power. So in Texas, you can choose your own power provider, as you know, with everywhere except for actually Austin, right? So Austin still uses LCRA. But in other parts of Texas, you choose your power provider. And so I have a contract where my power consumption, I pay 11 cents to consume power. And what I get paid to export power is I get paid the going price, which most times is about 2-3 cents. However, I have a contract with a group, David Energy, who Sunnova has a partnership with. I was actually the first person to sign up for this. I'm very glad I did. Where when they get the demand response signals from ERCOT that the price is spiking, they will discharge from my battery to the grid as long as I've got power available. And we split that 50-50. So during those times, I'm getting somewhere around 50 cents or more.
So, sometimes you hear about that. What is that called? Is that called net metering, or is that when you give back to the grid?
Yeah, so there is so net metering is a concept that basically talks about how do you get paid for the power you send back to the grid. And so in a lot of states, what it used to be is that if you sent power to the grid, you would receive a bill credit, and if you received power from the grid, that would be what you were charged. And in some cases, you would see folks where if it was the exact same amount sent and received, as far as like dollar per, you'd see folks wind up with huge credits on their bill. And the utility was paying them. In a lot of states, the utilities have pushed back against this and have asked for steeper discounts for power that is exported to the grid versus the power that's being taken in from the grid. California did some reforms a couple years ago that are well known. These are what became NEM 2.0. And the NEM 2.0 rules, and I'm going to have to make sure I may not be 100% sure on this as far as the percentage, but basically the export rate was about 75%, I think, of the import rate. So if you import power from the grid at 30 cents, you're only getting 22 cents for what you sent back to the grid. With NEM 3.0, that's now been taken to a very low number, which is only 25%. So if you send power to the grid, you're only getting 8 cents for it versus you're getting charged 30 cents for power you're consuming from the grid. So the utilities continue to try to find a way to penalize solar for even existing. Now, part of the rationale that we'll hear from the utilities really falls along two lines. One, hey, we've got to manage the distribution side of this. So we shouldn't, and if we're charging a fee on the import of electricity for managing power, we shouldn't have to pay a fee for managing on the import. To me, that's a legitimate argument. The second argument is, hey, the more people that go on solar, the more of the burden that this puts on people who don't have solar.
Puts more of a burden on people because
then they have to pick up the utilities stranded costs, the utilities investment that they have, because utilities just get, call it $1.10 for every dollar that they spend. Now, the way the utilities have tried to frame this is this hurts low and moderate income consumers because only rich people put solar on their house. It's actually not the case at all. The percentage of our customers that would qualify as low and moderate income, especially in states like California, match the percentage of those customers within the general population of California itself. So when you take a look and say, okay, who is this really affecting? I'll be fair. It can hurt the utilities. We're taking away some of the consumption the utilities are expecting folks to take with the investments that they've made and with the prices that they're charging. Because why? Because we're offering consumers electricity at a lower price that they get to make themselves. What is also not talked about is the fact that goes right back to that time of use comment I made earlier, which is we're sending power back to the grid. Solar customers are when the utility needs power the most. And when consumers have batteries, they can then make that an even more efficient process back to the utilities, where we can do it when the utility needs it. The utility can call upon the consumer with the battery. Hey, I need some electricity. Can you give me a little bit more electricity now? So cooperative agreements like that can help manage the grid even more and provide stabilization to the grid that you really can't do as far as you can't turn a nuclear reactor off and on. You can't turn a gas power plant off and on. You can't turn the wind and solar off. You can turn off your receipt of power from it. But if you're able to use batteries, you can do a lot more nuance. So solar customers continue to provide tremendous benefits. So you do find some areas where you do find unfriendly net metering, There are also a lot of states that are providing friendlier net metering environments because they realize the tremendous value that solar is bringing. And solar has one other option to it, which is if you're not going to allow a solar customer to be profitable with net metering, and that solar customer has a battery, then what's the incentive for that solar customer to interconnect and provide relief to the grid anyway? So that solar customer would be better off just not interconnecting with the grid and just to sip from the grid when needed instead of providing backup power for the grid. This is what happened in Hawaii back in 2015. The local utility was able to get a regulatory environment to make a very unfriendly net metering. The adoption of batteries in Hawaii jumped to nearly 100%, and folks were not interconnecting as a result. When that happens, the utility then said, hey, we could really use some interconnection. And so started paying people to re-interconnect back with the grid. There are other jurisdictions where we see this as well, where interconnection doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense because you're much better off just sipping from the grid when you need it and net metering with yourself along the way by using the battery.
Yeah, we see the outlook for batteries in particular to be pretty strong. And I mean, are you seeing that as well, just kind of given what you're describing?
Yeah, all of us back at the end of June, beginning of August, us and our competition all had reported earnings. And what you heard a very consistent theme was battery adoption was up a great deal. The biggest jump in battery adoption was in California because of the new NEM 0.3 rules that got adopted and went into practice in mid-April. It doesn't really make sense to have a solar system without a battery. Now, some folks still want to, and it does make sense if you're going to underpower your house significantly to, you don't really need a battery because the solar, you're not really sending much power back to the grid and you're just offsetting your consumption that way. But if you're going to build a decent sized solar system on your home because you want to offset even more electricity, I mean, adding the battery only makes the perfect sense in the world because instead of paying, only receiving 8 cents for this excess electricity, you're really avoiding that 30 cents for the excess electricity. And in a time of use, jumping up to, 60 cents or whatever the price is, you get to avoid that time as well. So it just really makes all the sense in the world for a consumer to not only add solar, but to make sure that they have a battery with that solar.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Sunnova and the business model, what exactly you guys do. When we talk about the solar industry, sometimes I don't know if everybody totally understands the different players in the market. Maybe you can describe Sunnova for us a bit.
Yeah, and that's a great question because when you do talk about the solar business and you talk about a solar ETF, what's in that solar ETF? You have a lot of folks who manufacture equipment, and I think that's really easy to understand. You make the widget, there's a cost to the widget, you sell the widget, did sales go up, did sales go down, what's your margin, what's your G&A, boom, it's done, right? There are a number of players who I would call just fintechs, right? They are just a shop that is packaging up and selling or packaging up and securitizing a bunch of loans. And when you talked about the interest rate, that's probably had an outsized effect on them because a lot of the folks who would be purchasing their loans are no longer purchasing the loans that they originated in the past and they're putting into service now. And further, because of the interest rates going up, the economics don't necessarily make as much sense to do a loan or a cash sale as it might make sense to do a third-party owned system, which would be a lease or a power purchase agreement. And so then there are a few folks that are in that third-party owned business. The idea here being that we put the panels on your roof, but we still own the system, and we charge the consumer for either having the panels on the roof, that would be a lease, or for the power that's produced by the panels on the roof. And traditionally, what's been a big difference between the two is a lot of folks have sort of associated those third-party owned systems, leases and PPAs as being service contracts because you're providing power, you're just providing it from a different place than the utility is. Whereas loans and cash sales have been typically seen as a purchase of equipment. Where Sunnova really differentiates is that for us, it's all a service. We actually have a service rep on our loans. Someone who just sells a loan, a dealer, a local installer sells a loan, you'll know that they only sell loans because they'll tell you two things. One, they'll say solar has no moving parts. They're correct. They'll also tell you that your equipment is warranted by the manufacturer of the equipment. That is also correct. What they don't tell you is how are you going to deal with that equipment when and if it has a problem or it breaks? Are you, the home consumer, going to call up the manufacturer of the equipment after your 1-year workmanship warranty is done and say, hey, can you send me the inverter or the solar panel in the mail, which has failed, so I can go up on my roof? And I'm not a licensed electrician, but I'll go ahead and pay it. No, absolutely not. You need to call a service company to get that done. And if you bought that system on an expectation of savings and all your savings get eaten up by the fact that you've got to hire someone to go fix that solar system, you're going to have one of two choices. One, you're going to get really, really pissed off, and you might even stop paying your loan because you're saying, you know what? It's not delivering what I wanted it to. Or you wait until the system's performance is so low that it makes economic sense for you to make one call and have one big repair actually done by someone, even though that may still eat up all the savings you've had in the past. What we find is that a happy customer is a paying customer. So we focus as a company on keeping our defaults and delinquencies low by keeping our service high. So we have what we believe is the industry's fastest response time. In a number of geographies, we have a response time that is 24 hours. And we're looking to roll that out. So by the end of the year, we think we'll cover about 70% of our service area with 24-hour service response time. And then resolution time that we have, an average for our resolution time is about inside 2 weeks. The industry standard for that is, call it 2 months to never. So we focused on the fact that if you're doing solar, you can either think about buying a piece of equipment or you could think about, am I getting power? And if it's power that you're after, then chances are you think about it as, I want power and you need a service. You've got a service. I don't look up at my solar panels on my roof and think, wow, that's a great piece of equipment. I look at my electricity bill and I say, wow, that's a great bill. And I'm glad I have my power. And when I hear my neighbor's generator kick in and I didn't notice anything happening because I've got that solar power kicking in 24 hours. And I know the guy across the street is just saying, hey, do you mind if I come over here and work because I don't have any power? And yes, this is all true stories that are happening that I'm telling you about. That feels even better.
What are you looking forward to for Sunnova? Where are you guys seeing the greatest potential for growth, and what's next?
You know, I think that our greatest potential for growth was within the services business and within just more and more systems that have more and more services to them. So if you think about a traditional solar system, panels on the roof, we provided the service and there was generally a power contract with it. So call it a 3-service system. We're going to give you electricity, we're going to give you service, and we're going to give you the means to pay for it. That's grown so that we have more and more services we're providing to a consumer. We're providing, in many cases, insurance to the consumer. We're monetizing incentives for the consumer and other grid services. We're giving them backup power resiliency through a battery. We might also pair it with a generator. In a lot of homes, they're getting an electric car. We're going to put in an EV charger into that as well. We might work with them to help enhance their HVAC system. So we'll partner with an HVAC installer and improve the efficiency. A lot of folks look at it as the right time. You know, hey, I've got better power. Let me make it work even harder for me. A lot of homes have older panels that have low ampage to them, call it 100 amp panels. And so they require main panel upgrades as folks add an electric car. So we'll do main panel upgrades as well. And there are other ancillary services that a customer may want as well. Tree trimming, that's not only something a lot of folks will look for themselves, but certainly it also provides a way to make sure your panels stay very efficient while you're doing something you should be doing anyway.
And then you're branching out into international markets?
We're definitely looking on the international markets. I don't think we've disclosed too much about sort of where our plans are there, but it's something that we spend a lot of time looking at because there are a lot of similarities, but a lot of things are lacking in international markets that we think we have good expertise in, but also a lot of folks over there who found a way to get into those markets. I think what you haven't really seen over there is a lot of profitability yet. But in the international markets, there's not really a big service side to it. That's very disaggregated. What they do seem to have a very strong, especially in Europe and Australia, it's a pull market. So folks are going online to find solar versus the U.S., which tends to be a push market where you go into a Home Depot or a Costco or somebody comes knocking on your door and says, hey, would you like solar? So it's a much more competitive market over there. it's a lot of folks have found ways to help dealers enhance their online presence by being aggregated in, whereas over here, it ends up being much more of a push market. And so we tend to have higher sales costs over here relative to the cost of the system than you're going to find over there in Europe.
So, I'm buying a house here shortly, and I would love to be able to put solar on my house. It sounds like I'll be to make sure that it continues to work well. I'll be spending some money regardless on service or ongoing service, whether I buy it or lease it. How does one go about making that decision?
Well, let's take your house. Okay, if I can ask you a few questions that might actually help me on understand your house. And these are the questions, by the way, that our Sunnova Catalyst tool, which we give our dealers, ask them as well. And it's basically, we'll look at two things. What is your house? It's, what are the characteristics of your house? What side of the street is it on? Do you have a lot of tree cover that needs to be trimmed away? What are your HOA rules? What does your roof actually look like? Because I have a whole bunch of. Now, my next door neighbor has a bunch of those bay windows on his roof, and that takes up room they could otherwise put on solar. The neighbor on the other side doesn't have those and actually doesn't have any of the vents and stuff. Their vents are actually kind of concentrated. He's got a great roof for solar, nice and flat, and provides that, right? How big is your house? And frankly, Ed, if you could tell me where you live and what your utility is, I can tell you exactly how much I can save you from that. So you can either tell me that, or I can go ahead and just, tell you how we would proceed along those lines once we would make that decision. But we would put all that into our quoting tool and then take that quoting tool and show you this is what the system would look like on your home. This is what would need to be done, if anything, in order to improve the efficiency of your system. Do you have a good roof? Do you need a re-roof on there, right? We also going to look and say, hey, do you have an electric car? Are you planning on getting an electric car? Because you might need a main panel upgrade if that's going to be the case. Are you in a market like California where maybe, one or two batteries is going to give you a very pleasant experience? You're in a small house, a 2,000 square foot house. Let's talk about what you need there versus maybe a 4,000 or 5,000 square foot house in Texas, where you're probably going to need to get about 5 or 6 batteries if you want whole home backup or partial backup. And if you want partial backup, let's talk about, do you need a load manager or not? Something where you can digitally turn your circuits off and on, set rules for your circuits based on what you have. Will you be more efficient if you switch out some of your appliances in your home? If you have an electric dryer, might you be more efficient to get a gas-powered dryer if that's the case? Or could you get a more efficient electric powered dryer that would help? Because if you try to think about, what can be your biggest energy vampires in a home? Number one is heat. Number two is motor. A lot of folks say, oh, I got a lot of TVs. I got a lot of lights. Those are so efficient. Even your fridge is pretty darn efficient, except for the motor that it needs on the condenser, right? But almost every appliance that you find in the house today is a very efficient appliance, but what's not is something that uses heating or cooling elements and something that has a motor. So we try to get all that information in there, and we'd figure it out with you and design that house to say, what's going to be the best solar package for you. Or in some cases, we'll say, this isn't a good house for solar. And I'll give you an example of that. You might find that you're in a well-wooded area that frowns on tree trimming. You might find that it is a northern latitude system where the house itself, the front yard is front-facing, and the HOA does not allow solar panels on the front side of the house. So that's not going to be a good experience to give you only east, west, and north-facing solar panels at a very high latitude. So all these are things that we'll actually take into account, and we'll reject those systems and not allow them. Now, we've also got to check your credit, Ed, but I'm sure your credit's just fine. But if the credit falls out, we have second chance credit solutions as well with third parties that we work with you there. You'd still get the Sunnova service. We wouldn't necessarily be the ones who own the paper. We'd still be servicing the debt. We'd still be servicing the system. But the interest rate is going to be a little bit higher.
Gotcha. So lots to work through there. I'll do that outside of the podcast. And in the few minutes that I have left, I love to start to close my podcast with one big question, which is, what's one long-term trend you see playing out over the next year or several years that you're really excited about?
Well, certainly being in the solar space, it's going to be the increased in distributed generation. I think that people owning their own power, owning their own destiny, being able to have the energy independence is wonderful for the consumer. But being able to use brownfield, your home, as where we're going to be building the next part of generation, to me, that's the most exciting thing right there. It's I go back to the Rocky Mountain High, right? And John Denver singing about, asking why more people, more scars upon the land. Well, more people are not going to do much about, but if we could keep the scars off the land, that to me, that would be one of the most wonderful things that we could do for our own future. So, the increase in distributed generation, the continuing falling of equipment prices that should enable that, the increase in domestic production and manufacturing that's been enabled by this administration, which, by the way, benefits red states, I think, disproportionately relative to what it benefits blue states. So it's really not the kind of thing that you could see people turn against as far as, what's the impact going to be. So from my tier, it's really just as we continue to build down this evolution of our grid. And I will also put my hand up and say there are a lot of utilities that see this as well, and they're making their investments to say, how can we improve our distribution network and make residential solar and commercial solar much more of the equation for how we're managing our power versus investments that we might make in building new equipment and transmission.
Excellent. All right, so I've probably got less than a minute with you. Can we do a quick round of trend or fad?
Let's do it.
All right. Fusion, trend or fad?
It's a bit of a fad right now. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that fusion is going to be the answer to free electricity. Give me another 2 decades, maybe I'll tell you it's a trend.
Private credit, trend or fad?
It's a trend. It's a trend that waxes and wanes, but it's a trend that will keep coming.
Pickleball, trend or fad?
Fad. I'm sorry.
I kind of agree. And cultured meat or lab-grown meat, trend or fad?
I'm afraid that's going to be a trend. I don't want it to be a trend. I'm a Texan born here. I love me a good steak. But I think that as we try to rationalize some stuff, you're going to see a lot more of folks trying to find alternatives to some of the meat products that we have out there. Like almost every single thing, it feels like a fad because it's not as good as the real thing. But that is changing, and it's going to change. Right? I mean, look, I could tell you about the thing that I'm excited about. We're so far away from it, but utilizing insects for our protein, as they do in a whole lot of other countries. I think that's going to be something that is just not being seen. But maybe, I have been told I'm the crazy one here, so we'll see how that goes. You can ask that for me in 10 years if that's a trend or fad, and now you already know what my answer is going to be.
That's awesome. Well, Rob, thanks very much for your time and your insights. What's the best way for people to connect with Sunnova, learn more about what you guys got going on?
www.sunnova.com. You can follow us on Twitter. I think that John, our CEO, has a great account. I think it's at Sunnova CEO. We also are on Twitter. I think we've got a Facebook page just like everybody else. You can even DM me at Rob Lane CFO. And what I'll do is I'll connect you with the right people, get you with one of our best-in-class dealers, and help you find a solution that works great for you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, guys.
And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Trends with Benefits.